Hello, you connoisseurs of classic albums and general lovers of great quality music. It's time for another solo video from me because Ben isn't quite back yet, but he will be very soon. But in the meantime, I'm going to talk about an album that I've owned, I realised the other day, for 30 years because it came out 30 years ago and I bought it, I think, pretty much on the week of release. I'm talking about an album that came out in September of 1993 by an American band. They had a hit single preceding this album. The single was called Mr. Jones. Can you guess what it is yet? Well, if not, I'll show you. It's this one. It's called August and Everything After by Counting Crows. Now, Counting Crows, I'd say this was their debut album. And they've continued as a band. They're still around now. They're still performing. Here's a picture of them from the inside of the original CD. And the main man in the band, the lead singer with the dready type hair there, Adam Duritz. Now, I must admit, he's the only figure of the band whose name I've ever known. So I think I should perhaps, before we go any further, give credit to the other members of this band. They were Matt Malley was the bass player, Charlie Gillingham was the pianist and organist. We have he also played accordion as well. Adam Duritz on vocals, of course. Steve Bowman was the drummer, and David Bryson on guitars. They also had some additional musicians on this record, including a guy called David Immergluck, who is a very talented multi-instrumentalist, plays things like pedal steel, mandolin, guitar, and he actually joined the band permanently a few years afterwards, but he was like a session player. I think he was just a friend of them on this particular album. And the other figure on here who's well known, Maria McKee, she sings some backing vocals on this record. And there's also from guitar, some guitar by the producer of the album, T-Bone Burnett. Now, this was before, I don't think I'd ever really heard much about T-Bone Burnett in 1993, but since then he's gone on to become a very big name producer in what people tend to call Americana type music, and he's worked with all sorts of artists. I know he's worked with Robert Plant and Alison Krauss on their collaborations. He's produced a whole load of different bands, and he's worked with classic artists as well as upcoming ones as well. And T-Bone Burnett now, there's a kind of a T-Bone Burnett sound, and a lot of artists have gone to him, and they tend to get a similar kind of sound now. But this was early on when he was producing, I think, and he certainly did give Counting Crows a pretty good sound for this. It's early 90s. It's got that kind of sound to it. But I think one of the things that this record has in its favour is that they played it pretty much as live, I gather, in a house. The studio, it wasn't a professional studio, it was in a house somewhere in Los Angeles. I'm not sure exactly whether it was up in the Hollywood Hills, but that reminds me of an album that was recorded up in the Hollywood Hills, the second album by the band, the fabled Brown album. That was recorded in a house I think was rented from Sammy Davis Jr. And the band and their producer John Simon also played a lot of the stuff as live, and maybe that helps to make the Counting Crows album a little bit special. I think it is quite a special album. I've found over the years, I've come across a few people who really love this record. I mean, it's not the sort of album that in this country, anyway, the UK, is considered to be a 90s classic by many people. There's a lot of other 90s albums that spring to mind a lot more. I think it was a bit bigger in the US. Maybe our American and Canadian viewers can tell me whether it was bigger in North America, but it sold, I believe, 7 million copies in the US. So maybe it is a touchstone 90s album in America. It was certainly a bit different to what was going on in America at that time, because of course the Seattle movement was the dominant one in 1993. Although Counting Crows, I guess, had a fair bit of influence from REM, and I think the REM albums Out of Time and Automatic for the People were perhaps, I think, an influence on this record. Counting Crows' other influences that you can sort of pick up from listening to them, it's not surprising that they were fans, and Adam Duritz particularly, who wrote most of the songs. I think he's pretty much the main writer of the songs and certainly the lyrics. Big fan of The Band, who I've just showed, and Van Morrison as well. I think there's definitely a Van Morrison influence on his songwriting. The hit single Mr. Jones definitely has a Van the Man sound about it. And there's a few other classic rock influences, which I'll talk about as we go through the track listing for August and everything after. Now, this album actually had a title song that's not on the album, although that was a bit of a rumour that persisted for quite a few years, that there had been this song, August and everything after, that wasn't used on the album. Apparently, it wasn't really finished at the time, although they since did finish it, and I think you can stream it on Amazon. Apparently, they put out this 8-minute song, which has a string arrangement on it as well, I believe. But the album's pretty much perfect without it. How can I describe it? If you haven't heard this album before, Adam Duritz is quite an emotional songwriter, so he's quite heart on sleeve and he's quite earnest in his performances, and he's got a quite distinctive voice. So he's the kind of voice that I guess you either like him or you don't. This is always the case with singers, isn't it? But yeah, I've always quite liked this album. I don't love it as much as some people do, who really, some people think it's one of their all-time favourite albums and they just absolutely love it. And I maybe haven't listened to it enough over the years to have that deep attachment to it, but it's certainly a good one. It took a little while to grow on me when I first bought it, because some of the songs are a little bit more instant than others, but it kicks off with quite a brave opener, really. They start with the song called Round Here, which just starts off with this simple guitar figure and Adam Duritz singing this song about this girl who lives in this small town in America. So there's a little bit of a Springsteen influence going on there as well, but it builds and builds emotionally, and then it goes into several sections. It sort of rocks a bit more and then goes back into this more mellow, melancholic style at the end of the song. But it's a real tour de force for the band, and if you like that opening track, then you're probably going to get into this album. The next song is Omaha, which is a little bit more sort of folk rock, a little bit of heartland rock, the sort of song that I could imagine the band having done in the 60s or the 70s, but it's a good one, gets the tempo up a little bit, got a bit of accordion on it as well, and that's something about this album that I quite like. There's a bit of accordion and mandolin and also quite a lot of Hammond organ as well. Mr. Jones is up next. That was the hit single, which if you've ever heard any of this album, it's probably that one that was played on the radio quite a lot at the time. And then it goes into a section of more ballady type songs, which is kind of like the emotional heart of the album. Starts off with Perfect Blue Buildings, which is quite good as a mood piece. And then there's Anna Begins, which is another of Adam Duritz's quite intense emotional songs. And then Time and Time Again kind of reminds me of maybe the Rolling Stones around the time of sort of the ballads that were on Exile on Main Street and the ballads the Stones did in the early 70s. A bit of that kind of vibe about it, but a song that works really well. And then we're into side 2 of what would have been the LP. I'm not sure exactly where the side 2 would have been, but I think it may well have kicked off with this track, Rain King, which is the most up-tempo song on the album. And that, to me, has a little bit of an REM vibe to it. It's a good track. And then Sullivan Street, which is a piano-led ballad, which may be my favourite song on the album and could have been, I think, a hit. If this had been given enough play, it could have been a really popular song. I'm pretty sure if a song like this had been done by a band with bigger stature at the time, like REM or a band like that, it would probably have become a big classic. But as such, Sullivan Street is a hidden gem, which I think you should check out. And then there's a song called Ghost Train, which I'm struggling now. I haven't listened to this album for a while. I'm struggling now to remember much about Ghost Train. So for some reason, that must be the song that's eluded me. Maybe it's a great deep cut that I've yet to fully appreciate. But I do remember the next track, which is Raining in Baltimore, and that's got a bit of a maybe a bit of a Springsteen edge to it. It reminds me maybe a bit of Randy Newman as well. It's certainly good one. That's a piano-led ballad, and perhaps the most emotionally wrought song on the record. And it finishes with the 11th track, A Murder of One, in which the tempo is raised again. And this is quite an idiosyncratic song for Adam Duritz. He seems to put a lot of his own personal stuff into this song. And he also recounts a bit of an old English nursery rhyme, which provides the lyric Counting Crows. The band's name gets mentioned at the end of the album, so quite a neat thing to do on the debut album. But the band followed this up with another album. I think they did one called, Recovering the Satellites was the next album, which I've never heard. And they then did an album called, was the next one This Desert Life? I may have got that wrong. But the one I have heard since, the other album by them that I've actually got, is one called Hard Candy, which was a bit more, how would I put it, a bit more commercial, a little bit more poppy almost in the song styles. It's quite a good album, but I can see why many people consider August and Everything After to be the defining record by Counting Crows, and one that they never quite perhaps repeated. It's almost as if they did such a great debut album, they were never able to make another one that was quite as special as that. But as I say, they're still performing, and I'm sure probably still a good band to go and see live. And I haven't listened extensively to the rest of their catalogue, so I can't totally comment on it. But have you listened to this album? Do you remember it from 30 years ago, if you go back as far as me? What are your views on Counting Crows and August and Everything After? Put them in the comments. I'd like to hear them, and I'll do another classic album quite soon. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. All the best for now.